In the winter of 1881, authorities in Leadville, Colorado, uncovered a mystery that would haunt the mining camps for decades. Beneath the floorboards of the McKenna Sisters Saloon, investigators discovered 23 sets of women's clothing, each neatly folded and paired with a handwritten note listing a name, age, description, and a price. None of these women had been seen in town for months, yet their belongings remained cataloged with the precision of a business ledger. The items spoke of lives suddenly interrupted: a blue calico dress faintly scented with lavender soap, worn boots carefully mended by hand, a silver locket with the photograph of a waiting mother who would never know her daughter's fate. Letters addressed to families back east lay unsent, filled with hopeful words about building new lives in the West. Just 3 days before the raid, Catherine and Margaret McKenna vanished, leaving only these grim relics behind. Their disappearance was so sudden that neighbors claimed they simply went to bed one night, and by morning their saloon was deserted, as if the sisters had dissolved into the mountain air. The investigation revealed a vast network of human trafficking that reached from Colorado mining towns to San Francisco brothels, exposing the McKenna sisters not as hardworking proprietors, but as participants in a conspiracy that thrived in plain sight. It proved that the true monsters were often those who greeted neighbors with warm smiles and casual kindness. Leadville in 1881 was a city swollen with ambition and desperation, perched at over 10,000 feet where fortunes glittered in silver ore. In just 3 years, the town exploded from a quiet valley into a city of nearly 30,000, its streets crowded with saloons, gambling halls, and theaters catering to every appetite. The once peaceful land of the Ute people had become a maze of muddy roads and smoke-filled air alive with the thunder of mining equipment. The promise of wealth drew seasoned miners, sharp-witted businessmen, and young women. Seeking opportunity, all swept into the chaos of a boom town where dreams and nightmares thrived side by side. Leadville was full of schemes, with swindlers conning miners out of their gold and families chasing dreams of prosperity in the thin mountain air. Into this volatile mix came Catherine and Margaret McKenna sisters from Boston, who arrived in the spring of 1879 with their savings sewn into their dresses and a determination to carve out a life in the booming town. What struck residents was not their presence, but their composure. In a place that unnerved even seasoned frontiersmen, the sisters carried themselves with calm confidence. Catherine the elder, at 31, was tall and striking, with auburn hair that gleamed in lamplight and sharp green eyes that could shift from warmth to calculation in an instant. Her commanding presence and flawless memory made her unforgettable. She could recall a prospector's children by name, a merchant's business deal, or a miner's sick relative weeks later. Men who had spent their lives ignored found themselves confiding in her, unaware that every detail was quietly stored away for potential use. Margaret, 3 years younger, was softer in manner, but no less effective. With gentle brown eyes, a soothing voice, and an almost maternal air, she made even the roughest strangers feel at ease. Where Catherine charmed and drew information from customers, Margaret managed the practical side, keeping accounts, organizing operations, and quietly assessing which patrons were vulnerable and which had families who might come searching if they disappeared. The McKenna Sisters Saloon soon became one of the finest establishments on Harrison Avenue. They purchased a prime corner lot and built a 2-story structure sturdier than most in town, with glass windows, solid timber, and a stone foundation that suggested permanence in a city of temporary shacks. Inside, a polished mahogany bar stretched across the main room. Pine tables gleamed with careful finish, and a small stage hosted traveling musicians. The walls were adorned with pastoral Irish scenes that Catherine claimed reminded them of their homeland, though no one had ever heard either sister speak with an Irish accent. Upstairs, they lived privately and rented out a few rooms to young women, insisting their tenants provide references and proof of character. To the public, this looked like a sanctuary, a place protecting virtuous women from the dangers of boarding houses known for vice and exploitation. Their reputation grew quickly. They were praised for offering struggling women respectable work, providing food and lodging, while teaching them the business of running a saloon. Ministers lauded their charity, and the local paper called them angels of mercy in a land where decency was scarce. What set them apart was not just clean glasses or good whiskey, but the belief that they were helping women build lives in a brutal frontier town. But in November 1880, the first cracks appeared. A weather-stained letter arrived at the town marshal's office, postmarked San Francisco, and written in a hand unsteady with fear. Inside were 8 pages of tightly packed words, describing events so disturbing that Marshal William Dugan read them 3 times before he could believe what he was holding. Emma Kowalski's letter was raw with desperation, the voice of a young woman who had seen humanity at its ugliest and was writing only because she refused to abandon her sister. She explained how tragedy had driven them west, a tenement fire in Chicago that killed their parents and left them with nothing but grief and the clothes on their backs. With no family left and no future in a burned-out city, Emma and her younger sister Anna had joined the tide of desperate souls, heading toward the promise of opportunity in the territories. Their savings from factory work vanished quickly on the journey, and by the time they reached Denver, they were broke, frightened, and vulnerable. It was there that they first heard of the McKenna sisters. In Leadville, women praised for helping newcomers find honest work and shelter. The prospect must have seemed like a miracle. When Emma and Anna arrived in Leadville that September, weary from the 2-day wagon ride through the mountains, the McKennas welcomed them with warmth. They were given hot food, clean beds, and gentle reassurances that their futures were secure. Catherine spent long evenings speaking with them, asking about their pasts, their skills, and their hopes, painting visions of respectable positions in hotels, restaurants, and wealthy households. She described a network of trusted contacts across Colorado and California, always in need of reliable young women. Emma wrote that for a brief moment, she truly believed they had found salvation, but kindness soon gave way to betrayal. After a week of hospitality, Margaret prepared what she called a celebratory dinner in honor of their new beginnings in California. The meal was lavish for the frontier: roast beef, potatoes, vegetables, fresh bread, and even a small cake. Yet within minutes of eating, Emma and Anna began to feel an unnatural heaviness, a drowsiness too sudden and deep to be ordinary fatigue. Margaret encouraged them to rest early so they would be ready for the journey the next day. Emma remembered surrendering to sleep with a strange unease, the world fading before she could question it. When she woke, the nightmare had begun. She was in a wagon jolting along a mountain trail, her wrists bound with coarse rope, her head throbbing from what she realized had been laudanum hidden in her food. Anna lay beside her unconscious, her breathing shallow and frightening. At the reins sat a tall, bearded man with a Spanish accent, who laughed and joked with Catherine as if they were old associates. When Emma demanded answers, he mocked her, explaining in crude detail that she and her sister had been sold to businessmen in California who needed workers for their establishments. In that moment, Emma understood the truth. The McKenna sisters' kindness had been nothing more than bait in a trap designed to feed a trade in human lives. The man transporting Emma and Anna made it brutally clear resistance meant violence, and the McKenna sisters had already been paid. His casual tone, as though he were speaking of cattle rather than human beings, horrified Emma almost as much as her captivity. She realized she and her sister were nothing more than merchandise in a trade of flesh stripped of identity and humanity. Their journey west blurred into weeks of terror passed from wagon to train to ship, always under guard, always drugged when they tried to fight back. What broke Emma's spirit most was discovering that they weren't alone. Dozens of other young women had been caught in the same trap, lured by promises of work, only to find themselves bound for forced prostitution in the brothels of San Francisco's Barbary Coast. They came from every background: farm daughters uprooted by drought factory girls, discarded by industry immigrants fleeing old-world poverty, only to be crushed by the false promises of the new one. The common thread was desperation, isolation, and misplaced trust in predators who saw profit in their vulnerability. Emma described her escape as nothing short of miraculous. Months into her captivity, a fire swept through the brothel. In the chaos of flames, fleeing men, and panicked cries, she slipped into the night. For weeks, she lived like a ghost, sleeping in alleys, hiding in abandoned buildings, taking scraps of work to gather enough coins for a ticket east. Every moment was haunted by the image of Anna, still trapped in that nightmare. Emma's letter to Marshal William Dugan was not just a testimony, it was a plea. Find Anna. Expose the McKenna sisters. Stop this evil before more dreams were crushed beneath it. Dugan was a seasoned lawman, hardened by years of frontier violence and corruption. But Emma's words shook him. He had known the McKenna sisters personally. Catherine, with her sharp memory and easy charm, had poured his whiskey at town meetings, while Margaret, with her quiet kindness, had once sent soup to his ailing wife. The idea that these women celebrated in town as models of refinement and generosity were secretly profiting from human misery seemed impossible. Yet Emma's descriptions carried details only someone who had lived under their roof could know: the exact layout of the saloon, the way Catherine tilted her head when she thought Margaret's habit of humming as she worked. It was too specific to dismiss. Dugan began a discreet investigation, careful not to tip his hand. He combed through missing persons reports from Leadville and nearby camps, a grim task made harder by poor record-keeping. What he found left him shaken. At least 15 women had vanished in less than 2 years, their cases scattered enough to avoid suspicion until viewed together. The pattern was unmistakable. Women arriving alone or in pairs, often broke and seeking opportunity, last seen in the orbit of the McKenna saloon. Many had spoken of Catherine and Margaret's reputation for helping women, their optimism captured in unfinished letters or casual conversations cut short by sudden disappearance. Each case fit the same cruel script. Margaret O'Brien, just 18, had arrived from Ireland with her cousin. Drawn by stories of the McKenna's kindness, she was seen entering the saloon one afternoon and never came out. When her cousin asked, Catherine claimed Margaret had left for Denver to work for a wealthy family and would write soon. She never did. Sarah Jenkins, 22, had been widowed en route to California. Penniless, she turned to the McKennas for help. Witnesses saw her meeting with Margaret about a job in San Francisco. That night she vanished, leaving behind a half-written letter to her sister in Ohio. Over and over the story repeated women in dire straits, placing their last hope in the McKenna sisters' promises, disappearing into silence. Local merchants questioned quietly, recalled troubling details that seemed innocent at the time: young women arriving at the saloon with small bags, clearly planning only a short stay, but never seen leaving. To Dugan, the pattern was undeniable. The so-called angels of Leadville were not saviors. They were predators cloaked in respectability, feeding human lives into a network of profit and exploitation. When Marshal Dugan casually questioned Catherine about the women who seemed to vanish after staying with them, she offered a smooth explanation that most of the girls quickly found work elsewhere and left town before anyone noticed, often catching early morning transport. On the surface, it was plausible. Leadville was a transient town where people came and went constantly. But Dugan's unease grew when he began hearing other testimonies. Sarah Fleming, who ran a respectable boarding house, admitted with deep regret that she had sent several desperate young women to the McKenna sisters after turning them away for lack of funds or references. "I thought those women were angels," she later confessed to Dugan, her voice shaking. I was sending those poor girls straight to hell without even knowing it. Even Dr. William Patterson Leadville's primary physician remembered odd encounters. He had been summoned multiple times to examine young women at the McKenna residence. The complaints were always minor headaches, faintness, or stomach troubles. But what struck him in hindsight was the women's eerie silence. They spoke only in clipped words, avoided his gaze, and seemed subdued in a way that now suggested fear or coercion. At the time, he had chalked it up to modesty or embarrassment. Later, he would question if the women had been drugged or intimidated into compliance. The most decisive piece of evidence, however, came from an unexpected ally, Dr. Helena Morrison, one of Colorado's first female physicians. Trained at the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, she had battled prejudice to earn her degree, and had come west with the conviction that frontier women needed doctors who would treat them with dignity. From a small office above Murphy's General Store, she had built a practice by listening, treating women without judgment, and documenting their conditions with meticulous care. By the fall of 1880, Dr. Morrison's private journals revealed a disturbing pattern. She had treated women whose symptoms pointed not to natural illness, but to deliberate harm. One case haunted her. A young woman named Clara Hoffman stumbled into her office one October evening, barely able to walk. Her pupils dilated, her speech slurred, and her memory fragmented. To Morrison's trained eye, the signs were clear laudanum or opium intoxication. Yet Clara swore she had consumed nothing stronger than beer the night before at the McKenna saloon. Her story was fractured with gaps in memory that frightened her more than the physical sickness. Clara had arrived from Kansas just weeks earlier. Another farm girl pushed westward by drought and debt. Alone and vulnerable, she had quickly attracted the sympathy of Catherine McKenna, who offered kindness and advice about employment. What Clara remembered of that night was Catherine pressing her to stay late, promising introductions that could lead to respectable work. The rest was a blur, darkness, confusion, and then waking the next morning with splitting pain and a sense that something terrible had happened she couldn't quite recall. For Dr. Morrison, this was no isolated incident, but evidence of a systematic pattern of manipulation and control. And when her notes eventually reached Marshall Dugan, they gave him the missing link he needed: medical proof that the McKenna sisters were not simply deceiving women, but actively drugging them as part of a larger, calculated operation. To Clara Hoffman, the McKenna sisters' friendship had seemed like a blessing. Alone in an unfamiliar town, short on money, and desperate for security, she had gratefully accepted Catherine's offer of a small, inexpensive room above the saloon and the promise of good meals. For a few days, she felt safe. But on her third night, Margaret invited her to a celebratory dinner. The evening was warm and pleasant, with the sisters sharing stories about their own struggles as women surviving without the protection of men. After dessert, Clara was suddenly overwhelmed by fatigue and excused herself to bed, thinking it was exhaustion or the thin mountain air. The next clear memory she had was waking nearly 12 hours later, violently ill with a crushing headache, waves of nausea, and the terrifying realization that an entire day of her life had disappeared. Her recollections were fractured and dreamlike, voices murmuring around her, the sensation of being lifted and moved. The strange impression that people were speaking about her as though she wasn't present. When she finally awoke in her room, her few possessions, money, clothes, family letters, and her mother's treasured Bible were gone. Margaret brushed aside her questions. With an unsettling explanation, Clara had supposedly been sleepwalking, packing her own bags while muttering about leaving town. Margaret suggested she had suffered a nervous breakdown from the stresses of frontier life. To a frightened, isolated young woman, the claim was hard to challenge. When Clara confided in Dr. Helena Morrison, however, the physician recognized the truth immediately. Clara's symptoms matched laudanum intoxication, a drug often slipped into food or drink to incapacitate victims. Morrison urged her to report the incident, but Clara hesitated. The McKenna sisters were admired in Leadville, and she feared being dismissed as hysterical or ungrateful, a reputation that could ruin her chances of survival in a town already hostile to women alone. 2 weeks later, Morrison saw a case that erased any doubt. 19-year-old Rebecca Tanner, newly arrived from Illinois, had been discovered wandering Leadville's streets at dawn, in nothing but her nightgown and shoes, dazed and terrified. Like Clara, she had last been with the McKenna sisters, who had offered to secure her a position as a governess in Denver. Morrison's examination revealed the same signs of laudanum poisoning. But Rebecca bore more chilling evidence: rope burns on her wrists and ankles, bruises from restraint, and a fractured memory of captivity. She recalled waking briefly in the back of a covered wagon with several others, realizing through her haze that she was being transported against her will. When the wagon stopped, she had thrown herself into the woods, hiding until her captors gave up and drove on without her. By January 1881, Marshal Dugan could no longer dismiss Emma Kowalski's desperate letter as an isolated tale. The evidence was piling up: missing women, strange illnesses, traumatized survivors, and testimonies that pointed again and again to the McKenna saloon. Still, his challenge was immense. The sisters weren't just business owners, they were pillars of the community. They had the trust of merchants, the praise of church leaders, and the support of townsfolk who saw them as charitable guardians of young women. To accuse them without irrefutable proof risked not only his career, but also unleashing turmoil in a town where the line between order and chaos was razor thin. By 1881, the McKenna sisters were more than just saloon owners. They had become symbols of Leadville's transformation from a rough mining camp into a city that prided itself on civility and progress. Catherine cultivated powerful allies, impressing men like Silver Baron Horace Tabor with her sharp mind and polished business sense. These wealthy elites pointed to the sisters as proof that the West could produce cultured, ambitious entrepreneurs who elevated the frontier. Margaret, meanwhile, secured the trust of the town's churches, her charitable acts convincing local ministers that she embodied Christian virtue. Together, they created an image of refinement and morality that few dared to question. Their influence extended beyond reputation. The McKennas were tied into Leadville's economy in ways that made them indispensable. They bought heavily from local merchants, hired workers for renovations, and even lent money to struggling shopkeepers. Their saloon generated steady tax revenue and provided jobs, making them integral to the town's prosperity. Marshal Dugan understood the danger of confronting such women without irrefutable proof. To accuse them was to risk ridicule, political backlash, and claims of misogyny. Powerful voices would defend the sisters, dismissing the allegations as slander fueled by envy. Worse still, if Catherine and Margaret suspected they were being investigated, they could vanish overnight. In a West connected by railroads and stage lines, it would be all too easy to reinvent themselves in another boomtown, leaving behind only unanswered questions and shattered lives. Dugan needed them caught in the act. But while he waited, agonizing over how many others might be suffering, fate delivered a witness he never expected: Anna Kowalski herself. Months after being sold into the brothels of San Francisco's Barbary Coast, she reappeared in Colorado carrying a story that was both horrific and miraculous. Anna's survival defied belief. Forced into prostitution in a 3-story brothel, housing nearly 40 women, she endured a regime of brutality designed to break even the strongest will. The women were drugged, beaten, and trapped in endless debt bondage, told they owed staggering sums for their transport, lodging, and food. The debts were fabricated carefully, kept unpayable, ensuring that freedom was always just out of reach. The Barbary Coast was not just a district, it was a machine that devoured women and profited from their suffering. Her escape came during one of San Francisco's staged police raids operations intended not to liberate women, but to make a public show of cracking down on vice while protecting the lucrative trade. As officers arrested panicked customers, Anna seized her chance. She slipped out through a back window into the labyrinth of alleys, her heart pounding as she disappeared into the chaos. Alone, starving, and hunted, she hid in the shadows of a city that thrived on corruption until she found passage back east. From there, driven by fury and an unbreakable will, she made her way back to Colorado, not to rebuild her life, but to bring down the women who had betrayed her and countless others. Her return would be the turning point Marshall Dugan had been waiting for. With Anna's testimony, the web of deception the McKenna sisters had spun around Leadville was about to unravel. Anna Kowalski's return to Colorado in February 1881 was nothing short of extraordinary. After months of hiding in cities where no one asked questions, working menial jobs for pennies, and scraping together just enough for passage, she finally made her way back to Leadville. The girl who had once been sweet and hopeful now carried the hardened look of someone who had lived through nightmares. Her eyes no longer held innocence, only rage, grief, and a relentless determination to see justice done. Unlike her sister Emma, who had chosen escape and silence, Anna came back prepared to fight no matter the cost. Her testimony was explosive. She laid bare the trafficking network with a clarity and detail that Marshall Dugan had never imagined. Victims were funneled through a carefully mapped route from Leadville to Denver, then to Salt Lake City, and finally to San Francisco. Along the way, safe houses hid captives, corrupt officials accepted bribes to look away, and legitimate businesses doubled as fronts. It was a vast, organized machine, and the McKenna sisters were crucial cogs in its operation. Anna described how the sisters handpicked their victims. They targeted young women who were isolated, desperate, and vulnerable girls without family money or powerful connections to protect them. Once a target was chosen, Catherine and Margaret wove a web of kindness and opportunity until the women trusted them fully. From there, the process was methodical. The victims were drugged, abducted, and transported westward under heavy guard. Anna had seen firsthand the brutality that followed. The McKenna sisters even kept meticulous records. In a locked cabinet in Margaret's private room were ledgers listing each woman's name, background, and the price paid for her delivery. Alongside these entries were trophies, personal possessions taken from the victims, like letters, jewelry, or keepsakes, serving both as proof of the transaction and as chilling reminders of lives stolen. Anna's revelations about the breaking process were equally horrifying. Once in San Francisco, women were told their families believed them dead or that law enforcement sought them as criminals. They were beaten in ways that left no visible scars, threatened with violence against loved ones, and forced to witness the punishment of others. The goal was to strip them of hope, to turn them into commodities who no longer believed escape or rescue was possible. For Marshall Dugan, Anna's testimony was both a breakthrough and a nightmare. It provided him with the evidence he desperately needed, but it also created an immediate danger. Anna wanted direct confrontation. She longed to expose the McKenna sisters publicly, to destroy the mask of respectability they wore so easily. But Dugan knew that her anger might lead her straight into a trap. If the sisters discovered she was alive, they might kill her before she could speak or vanish before the law could reach them. Leadville buzzed with unease as whispers spread. Something was stirring around the McKenna sisters, though no one yet knew the full truth. For the town, they were still benefactors and role models. But for Anna, they were monsters hiding in plain sight. And she was determined to drag their secrets into the light, even if it cost her everything. Anna Kowalski's reappearance in Leadville could not stay hidden for long. Those who remembered her as a bright, trusting girl barely recognized the hardened woman she had become, her eyes carrying the weight of nightmares no one could fully imagine. Whispers spread quickly, and the McKenna sisters seemed to sense that the ground beneath them was shifting. Catherine grew guarded, turning down invitations and keeping conversations short, while Margaret frayed at the edges, pacing at odd hours. Her hands trembling when she poured drinks and snapping at her staff with a paranoia that unsettled everyone around them. On a frigid night in March 1881. The tension that had been building finally erupted. Despite Marshal Dugan's warnings, Anna was done waiting. She had spent weeks watching the saloon, memorizing the sisters' routines. And that evening she saw what broke her restraint. A young girl of perhaps 17, exhausted and frightened, arriving alone and desperate, exactly the kind of prey the McKennas always welcomed. Seeing Catherine offer the girl food, warmth, and promises with that same gentle charm Anna had once believed in, ignited a fire she could no longer contain. Armed with a Derringer pistol and a satchel stuffed with evidence letters, documents, and testimonies from other victims, Anna stormed into the saloon. Her plan was simple, but perilous: confront the sisters in front of witnesses, expose their crimes, and force the community to see the monsters behind the mask of respectability. Public shame, she believed, would be a punishment more enduring than any trial. But the McKenna sisters were ready. They had anticipated something like this for weeks, sensing law enforcement closing in and former victims whispering in town. As Catherine calmly greeted Anna, her eyes sharp with recognition, she gave a subtle signal. Margaret slipped into the back, and within minutes, 3 armed men Anna recognized as the same transporters who had once bound and dragged her westward, took up positions around the room. Anna's voice cut through the saloon, silencing the evening chatter. With cold fury, she laid out the details: dates, routes, names of victims, descriptions of safe houses, and the horrific fates of women funneled through the network. She demanded the sisters admit their crimes, not only to face justice, but to answer the deeper question of how they could smile at women's suffering while plotting their destruction. For Anna, the betrayal of trust was the most unforgivable cruelty. Catherine's response was chilling. She didn't deny it. Instead, she praised Anna's resilience, speaking with the detached pride of a businesswoman admiring a rare product that had outlasted its purpose. She explained their trafficking as nothing more than commerce, a way to meet the insatiable demand of frontier cities where men vastly outnumbered women. In her eyes, young women were simply a commodity bought and sold like ore lumber or livestock. The air in the saloon grew heavy with menace as the armed men shifted, ready to act. Then the doors burst open. Marshal Dugan and his deputies, who had been monitoring the saloon and waiting for Anna to make her move, swept inside with weapons drawn. He had guessed her intentions and set his men in position, determined to prevent the night from ending in bloodshed. What followed would not only decide the fate of the McKenna sisters, but also tear away the thin veil of civility that Leadville had so carefully built for itself. The confrontation inside the McKenna saloon erupted into a gunfight that lasted only minutes, though to those inside it felt like an eternity. Smoke from black powder choked the air as bullets tore through walls and shattered glass. 2 of the sisters' armed associates were gunned down, almost immediately collapsing behind overturned tables where they had tried to take cover. Anna Kowalski, standing defiantly at the center of it all, was struck in the shoulder by a gunman before Deputy James Crawford cut him down with a single shot from his revolver. In the chaos of screaming patrons and gunfire echoing against the saloon's timber walls, tragedy struck. Margaret McKenna panicked, and reaching for a key to the locked cabinet that held their ledgers, was mistaken for an armed threat. Deputy Thomas Riley fired, killing her instantly. That key, her final act, would have unlocked the evidence that proved beyond doubt the sisters' guilt. Catherine McKenna, calm, even in the midst of bloodshed, seized her opportunity. While deputies focused on subduing the gunmen, she slipped through a rear exit into the maze of back alleys. She had no doubt prepared for such a moment. Despite an immediate manhunt that spread through the streets of Leadville and continued for weeks across Colorado and beyond, Catherine disappeared into the wilderness of the American West. Rewards were posted from Denver to San Francisco, sightings were reported in towns across multiple states, but none could be confirmed. Catherine McKenna had vanished into legend, leaving behind questions that would never be answered. The search of the McKenna saloon revealed horrors that even Marshal Dugan had not anticipated. Beneath the floorboards, investigators uncovered not only the clothing and possessions of missing women, but meticulous business ledgers and correspondence that mapped out an organized criminal enterprise stretching across the West. The documents detailed transportation routes, safe houses, and payments to corrupt officials who enabled the trade. Records confirmed that at least 47 women had been trafficked in just 2 years, generating profits of over $15,000, an astronomical fortune in a frontier town where most honest businesses scraped by on a fraction of that. Perhaps the most haunting discovery was in Margaret's private quarters. A cache of photographs showing young women in states of unconsciousness or visible distress, accompanied by written descriptions cataloging them as if they were specimens. These images were not part of the business. They were trophies, grim evidence of a cruelty that went beyond profit into something darker and more sadistic. The revelation sent shockwaves through Leadville and beyond. The McKenna case forced the frontier to confront an unsettling truth: that evil on the frontier was not always the chaos of outlaws and drifters, but could be as organized and methodical as any legitimate business. Federal authorities joined the investigation, dismantling trafficking networks that stretched across at least 6 states and territories. Arrests were made in Denver, Salt Lake City, and San Francisco, cutting into the machinery of exploitation the sisters had helped sustain. Anna Kowalski survived her wounds, but the ordeal had scarred her permanently. She had uncovered the truth, faced the women who betrayed her, and lived to see part of their empire destroyed. But she also carried the weight of every woman who hadn't escaped, every innocent life, reduced to a line in a ledger. For Leadville, the McKenna sisters would forever be remembered as the smiling faces who hid a nightmare behind polished glasses and polite words. Proof that the most terrifying monsters were often the ones you never suspected. Anna Kowalski's return to Leadville and her confrontation with the McKenna sisters gave her a measure of closure, but it also left scars that never fully healed. Wounded in body and spirit, she turned her pain into purpose, becoming one of the first voices to openly campaign against human trafficking in the American West. She testified before territorial and federal lawmakers, describing in unflinching detail the cruelty of her captivity and the need for stronger laws. Her courage helped shape new legislation that imposed harsher penalties for kidnapping and made it easier for law enforcement to coordinate across state lines, a change that would save countless others from the same fate. Anna's willingness to speak publicly, despite the stigma attached to victims of sexual violence, gave strength to other survivors who had long been silenced. Dr. Helena Morrison's meticulous medical documentation proved equally vital. Her records of laudanum poisoning and her testimony in court provided irrefutable evidence that supported the stories of trafficked women, evidence that helped convict several transporters and guards who had once seemed untouchable. She continued her medical work in Leadville, becoming a fierce advocate for women's health and safety, establishing protocols for identifying victims of trafficking and training lawmen to recognize patterns of abuse that had once gone unnoticed. Marshal William Dugan, promoted to U.S. Marshal, devoted the rest of his career to dismantling trafficking networks across the West. Yet he never stopped pursuing Catherine McKenna. For more than a decade, he followed rumors that she had slipped into Mexico or reinvented herself under false names in Western cities. Though leads came and went, she was never captured, her ultimate fate lost to history. The case left a lasting mark on frontier society. Churches established organized networks to aid vulnerable women traveling alone, and law enforcement agencies adopted new procedures for investigating disappearances. The McKenna affair revealed the unsettling truth that the myth of frontier lawlessness was not simply about lone outlaws with guns, but about sophisticated criminal enterprises that thrived by exploiting desperation. Most chillingly, it showed how society's assumptions about women, the belief that they were inherently nurturing, charitable, and trustworthy, had been weaponized as camouflage for some of the darkest crimes of the era. The McKenna sisters were able to operate not because they were geniuses of deception, but because they understood the psychology of trust. They exploited people's desire to believe in virtue and charity, twisting those expectations into tools of manipulation. Their story stands as a warning that evil often hides behind the most respectable faces, and the people a community trusts most can sometimes be those harboring the deepest secrets. So what do you think? Was the whole truth uncovered, or do secrets still lie hidden beneath the soil of the Colorado mountains? If this story unsettled you, share it with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit the like button to support our work and subscribe so you don't miss the next tale of horror and history. Until then, remember, sometimes the monsters wear the friendliest smiles.
Thank you everyone for watching the whole video. Please like and subscribe to watch more good videos.